Hello and welcome to Curator's Corner here at the Nevada State Museum. I'm Mina Stafford, the Curator of Education, and so I wanted to show you some of the things in our education collection. And because it's December, I wanted to do our pines collection. We have a program called Pines Are Fine, and these are some of the objects we use in that presentation. So pines, let's think about that. What does that mean? So first of all, a pine tree is a conifer. And conifer means that it has cones. And that's the opposite of a flowering plant. Flowering plants don't use cones, but conifers do use cones for reproduction. And there are male cones that are smaller and have the pollen in them. And then when the wind blows, the pollen comes out and it fertilizes the seeds in the female cone. And then when the seeds mature, they fall out or they get eaten by animals or whatever to help spread more pine trees, right? Okay. They also have needles. Pine trees have needles. And so instead of leaves, big broad leaves, they have these thin needles that have the photosynthesis happening for the plant. And there are a lot of plants that have needles and that have cones. It may not be pine trees, but there are also plants that are evergreens. So pine trees are also evergreens, and evergreen, it sounds kind of obvious. It means they're always green. That sounds good, right? But we want to know what it's the opposite of. It's the opposite of deciduous. Deciduous means that it loses its leaves, either because it gets really cold or because it loses the water. It's in drought conditions, so plants lose their leaves for different reasons. And so if you're in one place where maybe it gets really cold, a lot of the plants lose their leaves, but the evergreens would still be green because they didn't lose their leaves all at once. However, the pine needles do fall off of the trees because I'm sure you've seen the brown pine needles all over the ground. So, like I said, there are other plants that are conifers and that have needles, but that are not pine trees. So we want to know those apart. We want to be able to tell them apart when we're outside. So first of all, the pine tree. These are the needles from a Jeffrey pine. And the uniqueness of the pine tree is that the needles are held together in a little package. So there's a little bit of fiber here holding 3 needles together. And that's distinctive to the Jeffrey pine. Some of them have 2 needles, some of them have 5. It just depends. And so our mnemonic to remember what pine trees are is that pines come in packages. Right? So the other trees you might see are the spruce tree, which, like I said, also has needles and also has cones. But the needles grow straight out of the branch, so they're not in those packages. And if you touch them, they're kind of spiny, kind of sharp, right? And if we went so far as to cross-section the needle, it's actually square in shape rather than triangular or flat. So our mnemonic for remembering the spruce is spruce are square and spiny. Right? And then another plant that you might see, especially around Christmas time, they use a lot of fir trees as Christmas trees, is the fir tree. It has that distinctive smell of Christmas trees that you love to smell, right? But the difference is that the needles are flat. They're more like really small flat leaves than like the needles on the other trees. And they're soft. They're nice to touch. So our mnemonic for these is firs are flat and friendly. They're not going to hurt you. So that's how we tell those apart outside. And here in Nevada, there's a lot of there's spruce and firs and junipers and pines, just a lot of different trees. But I want to focus on the pine trees that are native to Nevada. So in Nevada, we have 2 state trees. One of them is the single-leaf pinyon pine, which you got to look at it closely, right? But the other ones are single leaf, Mina. Well, you got to look closely. There are packets. There is a little bit of fiber holding the needle onto the branch, but it is only 1 needle, which makes it the single leaf pinyon. And there's another pinyon pine tree, I believe in Colorado, that's a 2-leaf pinyon pine. So one of the reasons that that is the state tree is the nuts, the pine nuts that it produces in its cones. And those nuts have been used forever, for a long, long time, by animals in the area and by the native peoples of Nevada. They would harvest the nuts and grind them up and eat them, making sure they survived the cold winter. So other pine trees you might see out in the wilderness here in Nevada is the ponderosa pine. They're pretty big and full, and that's the really big tall ones you usually see up in Lake Tahoe. The Jeffrey pine, and the needles we looked at over there, the really long ones, were Jeffrey pine needles, and then this is the Jeffrey pine cone. It's also really big. So that's how you'd know you're looking at a Jeffrey pine tree, is the long needles and the big cone. And the sugar pine, so the sugar pine again lives in high elevation, and this is a really big cone because it also is a really big tree. And you might notice it has sap on the outside, on the trunk. So that's kind of why it's thought of to be sugar, because it's the sap. Right? And then there's also redwoods in the Sierra. So there's a redwood cone. And then the other state tree in Nevada is the Great Basin bristlecone pine tree. Now the unique thing about the Great Basin bristlecone pine is that they live, each individual tree lives for a very, very, very long time. They found one that lived more than 5,000 years, and it's still alive. So we don't know, right? So they have interesting functions in their roots and in their leaves and everything to help them live in really, really tough environments, high elevation, lots of wind, large variation in temperature from a hot day to a cold night. And also snow in the winter because they're at such high elevation. So the bristlecone pine are real survivors. They live in harsh environments and they survive for a long, long time. Anyway, so we're walking around outside. We might see some Jeffrey pine. If we're going up in the mountains, we might see some ponderosa pine. But if you're walking around in the town, parks, shopping centers, maybe your yard, a pine tree that you see a lot is the scotch pine. Now the scotch pine is used for landscaping, so it's not native to Nevada, but it seems to be everywhere. Like I said, in parks and things like that, not native. Anyway, you can tell that it's a scotch pine because it has this black on the inside and light brown on the outside. And they're easy to handle. They're small, hand size, they're smooth, they're not going to spike you. And so I like to use these for craft projects. Thank you very much for coming to Curator's Corner.